Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we are chatting with paranormal investigator, researcher, and ghost biker Miranda Young. Miranda hosts the popular web series Ghost Biker Explorations, where she highlights various historical locations and explores the history, folklore, and ghost stories, as well as conducts investigations to find evidence of the paranormal. Also, check out her weekly Facebook live stream, Ghost Biker Garage, featuring different guests to discuss all things paranormal. Welcome to the show, Miranda. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Eric. It's wonderful to be here.
So, like I said, you have the popular web series, and you're an investigator. So I always like to ask the origin story of how people got into the paranormal, especially paranormal investigators, because everybody has a different story or they had different things happen to them when they were kids. So how did you get into paranormal investigating and come to start the Ghost Biker series?
Well, like a lot of paranormal investigators, I've always been interested in the paranormal ever since I was a kid. And I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains of Northeast Tennessee. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who at that time, she was in her late 80s and ended up passing away in her mid to late 90s. And so I spent a lot of time down at her house listening to stories of where she grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, talking about a lot of folklore and history and Appalachian haints. And then when I wasn't spending time with her, I was at the library researching all the different stories. I never really had any type of actual experience that happened when I was a kid. But between her and my dad, they both really instilled the importance of storytelling. And that really got me interested in it, of seeing, if there's something else out there, learning more about some of these abandoned locations and kind of how things used to be. And so I also was a big fan of unsolved mysteries. To me, nothing is scarier than Robert Stack and hearing those stories.
Right.
So I used to also watch that and really freak myself out. And so throughout the years, spent a lot of time researching, talking to her, talking to other elders in the community, and hearing their stories. And about 11 years ago, I was approached by a guy that I used to work with. He saw that I had a background in photography. And so he sends me a message and he's like, okay, I've got kind of a strange question for you. And he said, would you look at some pictures? And of course, he didn't tell me he was an investigator, but he said, would you look at some pictures and kind of give me your thoughts on them? And so I was like, okay, sure. He sends me these photos and they're investigation pictures from previous investigations that he and his team had been on. So explained what he did, and he asked if I would look at those pictures and try to give a logical explanation as to the camera function, and then also, if it could be something that there was an explanation for. So started researching photos and analyzing photos for him. And after I had analyzed probably 20 or so photos, he invited me to go on an investigation. And it was a really neat little location in downtown Chattanooga. It was a bar and Mexican restaurant that's out on a marina that's rumored to have paranormal activity. And it was just myself and the other two guys. And we were there probably for about 5 or 6 hours. And of course, I had watched some of the paranormal entertainment shows on TV and kind of had a grasp, from that perspective. But actually going on my first investigation, that was something, you just didn't really know what to expect. And it didn't disappoint, the location or the experience. I was in there and got some really good Class A EVPs, had some interesting flashlight activity, some intelligent responses, and also what I believe I was touched. And so after that investigation, they gave me some more pictures and invited me on to another investigation and ended up inviting me to join the team. And so I was with the team for about 8 years, and I did their photo analyzing, their marketing, putting their videos together, as well as doing the investigations. And all during that time while I was investigating, I was out traveling by myself on the weekends and with work. I was out traveling to different rumored haunted and historic locations on my motorcycle. And so I was documenting a lot of this through photography and putting it onto my social media sites. And they were actually starting to get a lot of attention, some of these photographs. A lot of people wondering, what's the story behind this location? Is it somewhere I can visit? Because a lot of the places that I was writing to were places that had a very rich history, but maybe not really somewhere that people would think about going, like the Rat Hole tunnels or the Coke ovens, or just different really rich historical places. And they were also asking, the common question was, is this location haunted? And so I started thinking about it, and because I was going out so much and doing this on my bike, I thought, why don't I document this through video? And I sat down, started thinking about it, and came up with the branding, because I'm a designer. And so I came up with the branding and the look and kind of a whole marketing strategy of how I wanted to film it and put it out like a series rather than just releasing an investigation as I went. And really, that's kind of how Ghost Biker Explorations was formed. I ended up leaving the team because there just wasn't enough time because I was doing so much in both roles, there wasn't enough time to devote to that. And I was really interested to see where Ghost Biker Explorations would go. So stepped away from the team, and now at this point we're rolling into season 4. So it's been a really cool experience and just really different, because I've really been able to cover that historical narrative and really talk about the travel aspect of what I do in stepping away from the team and kind of doing it the way that I do it.
Yeah, and I really enjoy your show because you get into the history and the folklore and the ghost stories from the local people, and the majority of locations that you go to, people have never heard of. I mean, we've seen Waverly Hills on TV 1,000 times.
Exactly.
But I want to know other locations, and that's one reason I do my show here, is to talk to people, different experiences, different locations that you've never heard of.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's one reason I want to talk to you, and that's one reason I enjoy your show, because I dive into the history myself, and one of my favorite parts of investigating is the research.
Yes.
And learning the history. And I've said many times on the show that when you're investigating, the history and paranormal go hand in hand, because it can explain why a place is haunted and what particular spirits may be there.
Exactly. And that's really what I like to cover with mine, because some of the locations, one in particular, the Bleeding Mausoleum in Cleveland, Tennessee, that's one that, people have driven by this little mausoleum in the center of town, and some of them had heard the story, but they didn't know that entire family's tragic history. And they had heard the legends. A lot of them had heard those growing up, but they had also driven past this, every day, going to work, going to school, and, didn't really know that history until I covered it in my season. And I had a lot of people approach me and say, that's really cool, because I'd seen it, I just didn't know about it or know the entire history to it.
Right.
And so that's what I like to cover. I mean, I've been to a lot of the really large scale commercial haunted locations, and they're a lot of fun to do, and they're a lot of fun. I sometimes look at those as sort of places where you can hear the story of what's happened and kind of test to see if you can get some type of validation based on what other people are getting. But I really kind of look at those as sort of training, and this is just me speaking for myself, but sort of training for some of the other investigations that I do, because a lot of the places haven't been investigated or haven't been heard of. And like I said, I do like the larger commercial ones, but I really love the small town history, because if you don't have that history to go along with the location, then, you really don't know what's going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
For me, I always like to say, I mean, if as far as an episode goes, even if I don't get any type of paranormal activity, I like to choose locations that can kind of stand on their own historically, and that if, people that are watching, they'll at least find it interesting for the history, even if there's not any type of paranormal activity. And I always spend double the time doing the research before when I'm actually doing the investigation. I mean, we all know that sitting there and analyzing the evidence and everything takes quite some time to do. But as far as the actual investigation, I always say if I'm going to be spending X amount of time investigating, spending double or triple time doing the actual research part.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't understand that it's not always the glamorous stuff you see on TV. They pack a lot in 45 minutes, and they got to keep your attention.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is researching and then sitting in the dark for 8 hours, and you might not get anything.
Exactly. I mean, it's I'll use a lot of the standard tools just because you do want to fill that time with for the web series. But it really is. I mean, I actually just did an investigation at the Nickerson Snead house in Glade City, Virginia, and it was a full-scale 9-hour. I will sleep sometimes when I go on these investigations and video while I'm sleeping. And I thought I would probably do that at this one, but I didn't. I ended up investigating the full 9 hours, not sleeping for a full 24, investigating for 9. I mean, it was a long night, but it was so active. And there was a lot of time where I was just sitting there in the room, just asking questions and really not knowing if I was even getting some kind of response until I go back and review my evidence. I do like to listen with headphones while I'm there so that I can sometimes hear things in real time. But the reality is it doesn't always happen like that. And it can be what a lot of people would consider a slow, boring time. But there's just a lot more to it than what a lot of people realize, especially when you're trying to put it into a 20 to 40 minute episode. If you've got 9 to 10 hours of investigating, if you've got any audio recorders or static cameras or anything, I typically have 5 other cameras with me with audio and video. And so if I'm there for 9 hours, timesing that, by 5 or actually 10, because the audio and the recorders, you've got a lot of hours of review. And so trying to take that, if you are lucky to get some type of activity, and put it into a coherent story and put it in a format within that 20 to 40 minutes, it's a real challenge to do that. And so when you capture just 1 or 2 EVPs, for me, that just gets my adrenaline going and gets me motivated to want to listen to all that footage and see if we're able to capture anything that validates the historical stories that go along with it.
Yeah, and talking about equipment and evidence, of course, like you said, you use a lot of the same equipment, K2 meters and that and that type of stuff. And I think those tools are great when you have it backed up by EVP at the same time. You've got a REM pod or something going off, as long as you got the backup evidence there. But use a couple of things that I think are really cool in the way that you use them. And that's, one is dowsing rods, but the way that you use them, it's more of a scientific and less false positives.
I try to, yes. For me, like I said, I have all the other tools. I do really have to kind of watch because I am traveling on the bike. I've learned to pack really efficiently. And I've also learned to really plan out my investigations. And that's where the research for me comes in handy up front, because I can plan my trigger items and such. But my dowsing rods are always something that I have with me. And my reasoning for that, of course, I've always got my recorder and video cameras, but I like the dowsing rods because they are easy, they're simple, and they're also familiar. And if a person hasn't ever used the rods before, it's easy to look at them and say, okay, well, they're manipulating that. And they can cause some false positives just because we are human, and it is easy if you're not steady and focused for them to shift. But you can't really control them as easy because they are, kind of floating in that little metal sheath. But I've tried to come up with different ways while I'm doing the dowsing rods to like you said, to try to cut out those false positives by doing them blindfolded. Sometimes I will also use noise canceling headphones. And if I have another person with me, almost kind of like doing the Estes method, but using the rods. I've also done things where, like if I'm in a location, let's say, for instance, Waverly Hills. One time in particular, I was there and I was up in the morgue area. And so I printed off some different pictures that pertain to Waverly. And I was with another investigator, and I actually had them place those different pictures in different areas of the room. I think I had a doctor, a nurse, a patient, had a picture of like a random dog, and then just some kind of random picture that I had printed off. And I think maybe like some playground equipment or something. And I actually had the person that was with me blindfold me, and we went to a different area of the room. I was actually kind of disoriented at that point, and I didn't know where the pictures were located. And then just really sat down and started asking questions. Can you point to the picture of the nurse? And we were having the rods actually move and point to the location. Can you point to the picture where the bodies were stored, or point to the door in the room? So just asking simple orientation questions to kind of try to calibrate the moment. And then just the simple yes and no questions. Because the movement can be so subtle, I can feel the pull sometimes, but honestly, unless the camera's on me or someone tells me, I can't always see the movement of the rod. So that's just one way that I'll try to kind of cut out that false positive element when I'm using those rods. And even sometimes we've used a whiteboard and written questions down, and just to see if they can see or read what we're doing and respond with the rods that way. So the rods are definitely a tool that if I get the opportunity in a location, I really like to use those.
Yeah, and a lot of people probably don't know, but even when nowadays with all the technology we have, when you have a company go out and drill for a well, for a water well, a lot of them still use dowsing rods to find where they should drill.
Yes. And an interesting thing had happened. I was investigating over at my grandparents' farm, and they both passed away back in the early 2000s. And the house is over 100 years old, and it's not really somewhere that it never had anything negative happen. It's not even really anywhere that I thought would be haunted. We had several family members pass away there, but it was of natural causes. And so it's just a unique and interesting looking house. And so I went over there, took a few tools, took the Ovilus, took the REM pod, and I think K2 and the EDI Plus box and my rods, and was really just going to just kind of go in and just do a simple session. And I did not get anything except for 2 words on my Ovilus. And the Ovilus, for me, sometimes it seems like it just spits out mumbo jumbo random words. And I don't really always pay a lot of attention to it, but I had it turned on and had it sitting there, and it was being very, very quiet. And all of a sudden, I set the dowsing rods down beside of it, and one of the 2 words that I got on that investigation, as soon as I set it down, it said water. And I thought that was just the coolest thing, because the people who lived in that house before my grandparents, which would have been my grandfather's family, they used dowsing rods to create their pond and find the spring that was there on the farm. And so it just made perfect sense. I think the other word that I got was bake, which is a utilitarian word for a farm, but nothing else. Everything else was quiet, no other activity. But I thought that was actually pretty cool, that as soon as I set the rods down, it's like, oh, I know what this is. This is used for water. And so I'll use them to ask yes and no questions. I'll ask them directional questions. And then I've even used them, if I've been at a cemetery, to try to direct me to the specific area that maybe I should investigate. And, another thing that I think is really cool about it is, I've been at some places where I've experienced crazy battery drain. you don't have to worry about that with these. I mean, they're
Right.
just an all around, for in my opinion, they're just an all around good tool that is familiar and easy. And, if you do it right, you can cut out that human element of false positives.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, with all the technology, they still use them to find water. So
Yeah.
there is some sort of validity behind them. It's not just some kind of folk magic or,
Right.
and when I was a kid, I even saw an older gentleman, he was probably 80s, 90s, take a forked tree branch off of a tree.
Yes.
Yeah. And the tree branch bent like straight down, and he couldn't have done it with his hands by twisting it because he's holding the forks and to find water. Yeah. It's insane how something that simple, you can get such results.
Exactly. They say willow branches are really good for that. And I've even heard, I've not tried it yet, but I'm actually really interested to try it at a couple locations that I'm going to be investigating this year. And I've read a couple articles on it, but they say that you can actually use the dowsing rod to find bodies and to help identify like certain characteristics, male, female, that sort of thing. I know that at the Grand Old Lady, which was a place that I investigated and highlighted at one time, there was a accident on the railroad tracks there. The article that I was reading, it talked about where some folks had come in and they had actually used dowsing rods to locate bodies along the railroad tracks. And this was over time, the bodies, had been covered up and lost. And I thought that was pretty interesting because he was talking about the science of how he used the rods to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to talk about the dowsing rods and the whiteboard because I've never heard anybody use those in connection. And I've seen people, investigate with the dowsing rods, but never going as far as you have to do the blindfold and that type stuff so that you're not influencing it. And then printing out the pictures so they can point. And like you said, it's familiar to a lot of spirits because, a lot of spirits that we're trying to connect with lived back when they used dowsing rods a lot more. And it was, just a common tool. So
Exactly. And if someone's going to ask me, one of the things that I'm always fascinated about on these investigations, I mean, yeah, it's great if I get a voice. It's great if I get something that kind of is validating that history of what's said that happened in the home. But for me, I'm often questioning, can you see us? Do you see color? What are you experiencing in this moment, when I'm in here asking you these questions in your home? And so that's kind of what led to the experiment with the whiteboard, because a lot of the time I'll sit down in front of a camera and I'll ask, can you see me? And there have been times that on the spirit box or on the dowsing rods or whatever tool I'm using, because like we spoke about earlier, it's great when you get a response, but if you can get it validated on at least two tools or get them to work in conjunction with each other, it's just even more powerful. And so if I'm getting a positive response that they can see me, that's great. But I thought I would take it a step further and either, ask, hold up some fingers and say, can you tell me how many fingers I'm holding up? Can you flash the flashlight this many times? Or can you knock this many times? Or can you call out the number? There have been a couple occasions. Revenant Acres in Indiana was one of them where I was holding up fingers and getting responses back. I even took the whiteboard. I did a lot of whiteboard experiments at the Grand Old Lady, and instead of asking the spirits to knock, I wrote down, "Can you knock?" on the whiteboard. And there were a couple times that I was able to get some kind of response back. And, and too, that just kind of, if you were writing something down in that moment, it sort of cuts back to where people say, oh, well, there's someone back there staging this or whatever. Well, they don't know what I'm going to write, in that moment if there's someone in another room. So, like I said, I'm real fascinated by that. Can they see us? Can they read? We're often asking them to, on like a REM pod or on a K2, to say, can you touch that green light and take it all the way to red? I really don't even know if they can see that color. Maybe sometimes that's why we're not getting a response. Or a lot of the spirits, if it's a location like Waverly or something, I keep going to that because it's such a over investigated location. But, if you ask one of them to touch a light, well, a lot of these folks are used to the light being a candle. So you're asking them to touch something that, unless they are used to investigator tools, they may be afraid to touch it, even if they can see the color. So that's why, for me, the rods and the board, if someone's going to ask me to touch something, I would much rather touch a rod and cross that than reach and touch something that makes a loud sound or changes color that I don't quite understand. So I try to think of it from that point of view and look at different experiments that sort of are a little bit different, or at least kind of push the envelope on from that aspect. I mean, it may seem kind of crazy, doing the spirit rods blindfolded, but I've gotten some pretty cool results. And it's always cool whenever you're asking these questions and you don't really know what's happening until after you go back and review. And when you see it actually responding, it's pretty cool.
Well, I think when you're investigating, and as an investigator, I think you need to think outside the box and use different methods and stuff. And especially, it's even better, like we were talking about, when you can do kind of a blind experiment to where you take more of the human element out of it and more of the contamination out of it. And
exactly.
Yeah. And I just think, I think it's very important to try as much as possible, because, when we're using things like K2 meters and EMF meters and REM pods and that, I mean, that's electronics. They're definitely fallible. And I mean, I've seen some REM pods that when the battery gets low, they go off.
Yes.
So yeah, to use something like the dowsing rods and the whiteboard, just taking it back to simple uses and simple stuff for, like you're saying, maybe the spirits are afraid to touch the light because it might get burned, because that's what they're used to. And yeah, I just love that approach.
Well, thank you.
What have been some of your favorite locations, whether it be just because of the history or the actual evidence that you caught while you were there?
There's quite a few, just because of some of the different locations. One of my newly favorite ones that's just quickly rising, on the charts for me is the Grand Old Lady, because of the interesting history. And it was creepy just being there. I investigated during a weekend with Soul Sisters Paranormal, and I had it on Friday night and they had it on Saturday. And I was in there. It was just myself and a videographer on the Friday night. And I mean, you didn't even need any type of ITC equipment or anything. The voices there, the disembodied voices, just stood on their own. I mean, I've not been anywhere like that if you were using a spirit box, you could hear them outside of the spirit box. It was just like they didn't need it and they didn't want it to communicate. Another place that I really enjoyed, I highlighted in season 3 as well, and it was the 1944 troop train accident. And I actually went into this location. It's never been investigated before. It was a challenging place because I had to pull the motorcycle off on the side of the road about a quarter of a mile away from the actual train wreck site, and hike down off this mountain road and hike back and try to actually find the location. I didn't know what I was going into. So it was a daytime investigation, which had its own challenges because you did have the roads up top of these mountain roads, and then you had the water noise because I essentially sat down on a rock in the middle of the Clear Fork River, and you had the train wreck site behind me, as well as the train tracks and then the road above. So it was a daytime investigation. I had to use my Ovilus. I had to use my spirit box because it was just, I did get 2 EVPs out of thin air, but I really didn't expect to really get much activity just because of the nature of it. But it was really fun to investigate because I really enjoyed being able to share this history and then also to investigate, do a daytime investigation, and then also kind of do some techniques. Had a great spirit rod session on that one. And it was just something kind of different. And the activity that I got was surprising. for me, I found it unfortunate because, I didn't even know about this accident. And it was it was in the top 10 major troop train accidents of all time. And because it killed, I believe, let's see, it happened in 1944, and it killed around 40 troop recruits on this wreck. They were on their way to their boot camp, and it's just marked by a little 8x8 sign on the side of the road. I was out riding my motorcycle, saw the sign, and thought, well, what's this about? You couldn't even see where the accident had taken place because everything had grown up around it. And the plaque that was on the middle of this rock in the middle of the Jellicoe Narrows had been washed away. I think a Boy Scout troop had put it up to commemorate this, but it had long since been washed away, and you just really couldn't easily get down to it. So it was really cool to research this and be able to share. And I did a little memorial at the end of the video showing all the members of the accident, because I think a lot of the time people forget that some of the people that the spirits we're talking to were people at one time. And so that was actually one of my favorites just because of the history, and the paranormal activity that I got was really just a bonus.
Yeah, and it's amazing how many places that we drive by every day and not know the history. Like that's an important history, being a huge wreck and all those people, dying, and those being, troop recruits that were going to go in to serve our country. And then, people, probably hundreds, if not thousands of people drive by that every day and never know anything about it.
And that's what I say about what I do with Ghost Biker Explorations is I try to highlight some of those areas. Last summer, I did a haunting ride with Ghost Biker, and I put together it was like 145-mile ride across the mountains of Northeast Tennessee. And I took these little waypoints, pretty much any town that you went through or little incorporated or even unincorporated area, and found any ghost stories that were involved in those areas or any kind of founding history that was unique. And a lot of these places were old mining towns, had a lot of dynamite explosions, had a lot of mining tragedies. One of them was a English utopian society that had pretty much met their demise through typhoid. I mean, throughout that 145-mile ride, I think I probably had about 20-something stories. And so as a biker, you're just kind of riding through, seeing these beautiful areas. But when you really learn the history, there's a lot of haunting information or interesting historical information. So that's what I tried to do with this. And it ended up actually being a real successful ride. We ended up having over 100 bikes that showed up and did this ride. Yeah, and so I put it together in a video that I released before the ride so that they could see the ride and see the places and the history and hear the stories of what we were going to be riding through. And it was just really neat. And that was actually how I had found out about that 1944 troop train accident, because it is literally an 8x8 sign that's just tacked up on a light pole. And once you really start drilling down, it's a really huge history that shaped that entire area that a lot of people just don't know about.
Yeah, and a lot of times with doing that research and finding things like that, you're kind of keeping that history alive, to whereas those people's families, because it's been so many years since it happened, those people's families might have even forgotten that happened, and the story wasn't handed down. So in a way of telling that history of these different smaller locations, especially, you're kind of keeping those people, their memory alive and that history alive, and telling their story a little bit.
Exactly. It's amazing to me when I talk to people just from the area that I'm from. It's like the history just kind of stopped at one generation, and people just don't seem like they really pass it along like they used to. And so in essence, once people quit telling that story, it dies. If it's not written down anywhere, that's a lot of history lost. And that's one of the good things that I can really say has come out of the paranormal and paranormal tourism. And then just the interest in it, in and of itself, are people like myself and you and Soul Sisters and different groups that are really history focused. That interest has kind of been renewed, so it's great to see people that, yeah, the paranormal is great, but that's taken that history and researching it and then trying to share and spread that. I think that really does so much for the community.
Yeah, and I think you get a lot more people interested too in the history if you
Mm-hmm.
wrap it in the ghost stories and then teach them about
Yes.
the history at the same time. I think people, they think history and they think, well, it's just boring stories or whatever, a lot of time lost. And so when you put the ghost stories in there, you pique people's attention and they actually pay attention to the history. And I think it gets some people more into the history because they're like, well, now I want to know why these ghost stories exist.
Exactly. And, a lot of the people who watch my show are not necessarily paranormal enthusiasts. In fact, paranormal enthusiasts are my smallest demographic as far as the people who watch my show. And I've gotten a lot of people interested in it because I cover the history. And so they stick around for the ghost hunting part. And then the people who are in it for the paranormal, several of them have told me that, the history piqued their interest afterwards because they didn't really know that. And you can really see where the history and the haunting goes hand in hand. And like you just said, where sometimes you wouldn't even really know why this haunting was happening if you didn't have or know that history. So it's been a real delicate balance making sure to put that in. But like I said, if even if it doesn't have any paranormal activity while I'm investigating it, I'm still going to highlight it just because I want to pick a location that has an interesting enough history that people may not know or at least find fascinating if they're going to watch it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important because you highlight, and I try to do this with my show as well, but you highlight places that people don't know, like we had said, and it helps those places with the paranormal tourism. And a lot of these historical places, they rely on tourism for all of their money. They're non-profit or not-for-profit, and they get all their money from people walking in the door, taking a tour, or doing events. And so to get more people aware that there is these places around you, not just the big ones that you've heard, like we talked about Waverly Hills, there are smaller places. And a lot of them, especially I've seen in the Middle Tennessee area, a lot of the smaller places have turned to doing paranormal investigations and opening it up to ghost tourism just to make money during the pandemic being shut down because of the coronavirus stuff. And a lot more locations have opened because of that.
And, it's sort of in a sense, the ultimate social distancing type thing and hasn't really been too affected by the pandemic. I know that, more people are believing in ghosts or the unexplained. They're believing in that more now than ever before. And so, I know one of the big things, my parents were teachers. And so they had the summers off. And so they would take myself and my brother and sister on, the family vacation. And they would always make sure to include some type of historical location, whether it be a president's house or something, some type of old plantation or some type of just, old hospital or whatever. They would always include that. And of course, it was always the historical story, but I can't tell you how many times on every tour we ever did, inevitably somebody would always ask, well, is this place haunted? And that would have been back in the 80s, before all of this had become, as common and mainstream as it is now. And so to be able to go back to those places now as an adult and be able to spend the night in there and spend that time, touching those tools and doorknobs and banisters and everything that haven't changed since, the historical time when the location when it was in use, being able to go in there, have that experience, and actually be able to sit and communicate and want to tell the spirit story, I just consider it a real honor. And it's real exciting for me to be able to see what I saw back then and experience as a kid, but then be able to be in there now and do and have the opportunity to record what I'm doing and share that history and then share that experience out there.
Yeah, and also to get excited to maybe connect with those people that you heard about when you were a kid and now you're back in as an adult, but to actually have a conversation with these people.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that to me is just the most exciting part about it, because a lot of the time when I go in, a lot of the time I do get pretty good results, or at least unexplained activity that I enjoy putting out there to say, hey, I was able to account for what was going on outside of the property, account for what was going on inside, and where, if it was just me or if it was just me and one other person, we're able to account for all of those different variables. And we got this strange and unexplained response, or, this strange and unexplained flashlight activity, responding to these questions, to be able to put that out and create that dialogue with somebody, or be able to share and somebody say, oh, wow, I want to go check this location out and look into it further. That's just a cool and exciting experience in and of itself.
Yeah, and to also put that stuff out there, and maybe somebody will watch it that's having experiences in their own home, and it maybe makes them feel a little more comfortable because they, see you doing it, and it's not scary. Right. It's not something trying to hurt them, and they maybe it calms their fears a little more about stuff in their own house.
Exactly, and I love a good creepy, spooky experience, and I do like the darker hauntings and the darker tragic stories as well. But one of the things that I love to show, I think that sometimes people tend to go more for the dark and negative, but I like to be able to show that it's not always scary. It's not always malevolent or negative. And really try to put that out there as well, because I think some people, especially, in this area, think a lot of the stuff, of being dark. And so, I like to be able to kind of show that contrast, that's not always the way it is, and that it can be a positive experience. It can be positive historically. It can be positive as in, just telling the story. Now, that doesn't mean that there's, like I said, there's not dark stuff out there, because I have had a couple episodes where I've covered darker stuff. But yeah, that's really what I like to do, is go in and share that history, and also show that, there's a little more to it than just, running scared in the dark.
Yeah, and it's not all this hype and drama that it's always made out to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, I did speaking of that, I was a guest investigator a few weeks ago at Thomas House in Red Bull Springs, Tennessee. And we did an event for just first responders. A lot of them came in, and at the beginning of the night, though, a bunch of them were like scared. And, we were trying to calm their fears, like, don't believe everything you see on TV. Right. And then about halfway through the night, we got a bunch of them like, this is awesome. We're having so much fun, and they saw how it was just laid back. And just trying to explain to them, these were once people too. We're just trying to have a conversation like we would with us sitting right here. And we're just trying to bridge that gap between this life and the next. And it's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing, scary there. There's nothing trying to hurt you. There's nothing going to hurt you. And like you said, there are some places where there are darker things. I think for the most part, and I've said this quite a few times on the show here, but for the most part, if you were nasty in life, you'd probably be nasty in death. If you're just a nasty human being. Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of what people experience is just, especially in their own homes, I think it's just spirits trying to get their attention. And you can look at it in a way to where, oh, well, that's negative. They push something off the table, or, well, maybe that's the only way they can get your attention.
That's exactly right. And that's something that I often tell is I'm careful to say, rather than negative or dark, more aggressive. because again,
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
that's how they have to respond. And who knows? I think that there are just different, I don't want to say different levels, but I think there's different abilities of spirit communication. Some of them can speak, some of them might not be able to speak, some may be able to manifest. But, it's, if they're going to get in contact with you, if there's a message or if they want to get your attention, you can't really limit them. They'll knock something off. If they want to communicate through a fire detector, they can do that. If they know how, to manipulate the item in front of them. So I'm with you. I mean, I've been to some, Brushy Mountain State Prison. That was one of them. I mean, you're in a prison. Of course, you're going to have
Right.
some
Right.
some negative activity. You're also going to have, some spirits that are oppressed. And, another example, Willow's Weep, that I investigated this past year and highlighted on my last season. It's got the reputation of being the most evil house in America. And I was hearing all these different stories, and there's a whole laundry list of things that supposedly or allegedly happened in this house. I have no doubt that it's negative and dark. From my experience, it was not the most evil house in America. It was a lot of hype in that respect, but I've also talked to a lot of investigators that got a lot of different activity than what I got there. That was one of them. It was just myself and another female where we investigated for, I guess we were in there for about 15 hours, and we did sleep for a few hours. And there were a couple investigators that they said that they essentially went in, had some really negative activity, and they wouldn't sleep in there. They wouldn't even hardly go in there. So for me, I mean, it was a very sad place. It was very oppressive, honestly. For the state that the house was in, I sort of felt bad for the spirits because just the way the state of the house would be oppressive enough, with
Yeah.
bats and dirt
Yeah.
and just unmowed lawn and everything. It was definitely sad. I honestly did not believe all of the stories that supposedly was happening or had happened in that house. I think that some of them were true. I think that some were probably embellished. But it's always interesting to me when that's the case, when a location has a reputation and you go in, and I was not going in at all to debunk or anything like that. I really didn't want to know too much about other people's experiences.
Right.
So I didn't read or I didn't really talk to anybody. I had seen the show where they had talked about, and of course I had done my research as to some of the things that had supposedly happened in the home. But I also sort of felt like, that because of the way the activity was in there, that you could kind of influence what your experience was going to be in that location, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go in with that expectation that it's the most evil home in America, I think that some of the activity kind of mirrored that perception. But honestly, I mean, I had to throw a lot of evidence out because, and I ended up having to use a lot of spirit box stuff because there were so many bats up in
Yeah.
the attic that I couldn't determine. I couldn't safely say this is unexplained, and put it out there as like, while this sounds cool, this is bats,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So I've had that happen on some occasions too, where the hype. I mean, got a lot of activity and a lot of strange activity, but I mean, as far as the negativity or the darkness of it, it just wasn't there. But that was my experience. Someone else may have a totally different experience. And I like to really show that because I think that sometimes places get a reputation that's not necessarily accurate.
Yeah, and I think it's like anything else in life. If you go looking with the expectation that this place is evil because of the stories that you've heard and from other people, and
Mm-hmm.
and you go in there with that expectation, then that's probably going to be the experience that you have.
Right.
And I think also some other locations, like you were talking about Brushy Mountain, and then this place, you going in as a female, you might get
Mm-hmm.
treated differently by the spirits
Yes.
than men going in, and maybe at that particular place, for whatever reason, men go in and have a harder time than females do, and
That's
and and
right.
it could just come down to it's a female spirit and they relate to you, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe they were abused by men because
Mm-hmm.
100 years ago, women weren't treated that great. And
That's
so,
right.
and women were more like property and that type of stuff. So you got to look at that history. That factors in with the history as well to how
Absolutely.
the activity and that type of stuff. Because especially, definitely you going into Brushy Mountain, you're probably going to have a
Mm-hmm.
different experience than men going in there because it was a male prison. It was some of the nastiest people in the country.
Exactly. And, I've investigated that location on 6 different occasions, and I love Brushy. I actually grew up not too far from there, and we went in as a senior trip. They took those of us that were 18, and we got to go into the prison, and that was when it was still in operation. That would have been in 1998. And I remember having a conversation there. I think there was about around 20 of us that went. And I remember having a conversation with one of the guys that was in there. They called him Snake, and he was in there for murdering his in-laws by setting their bed on fire.
Wow.
And just, it's a real surreal thought when I step back and look at it, because here's these guards standing there in full armor with this prisoner. They had their shields and everything. And here's 20 high school students just standing around in a semicircle listening to this guy talk about how he had killed his in-laws and attempted to kill his ex-wife. And so to go in there, see it in operation, and then go back. Of course, now it's a tourist attraction, but over the 6 times that I investigated there, I only investigated it once after it opened up as the distillery and as the tourist site. The other times, it was completely closed, and only 2 of the 6 times they had started on construction. And so it was really neat to see the activity change from when I was in there the first time I investigated to the last couple times where they were doing the construction, and then as it was opened as an attraction. I actually ended up, it was part of a 2-night investigation, a full weekend. I ended up investigating the first night by myself, and the next night I investigated with 4 other teams. It was an Easter weekend investigation. We were trying to see if that played any part on any of the change of activity.
Yeah.
And so that first night, I had investigated all night long, knew I was investigating the next night. So I ended up sleeping about 3.5 hours in solitary confinement in the area that they call the hole. And so I set a recorder up, put a camera up, and slept. And I ended up getting about 3 minutes and 15 seconds of some of the best Class A EVPs I've ever got. And they were intelligent and residual. And the intelligent one, the footsteps were, it sounds like somebody is in the prison because it echoes being made out of that stone. And it sounds like somebody walks right up to my cell where I'm sleeping. And this just breathy, creepy voice says, "Night, night." And I had been asleep, I think, about 25 minutes in when it happened.
Wow.
It's as clear as can be. And I got what sounded like people talking between the cells to each other. Laundry is located up above the solitary confinement area. And of course, at this time, there was no power in the prison when I had slept there. And you can hear the sound of, dryers make that distinguishable sound when the door closes and then when they're running. And it just sounds like a dryer running overhead and people saying, "Help me." These were disembodied voices. There was no ITC aids or anything. And then the weirdest one during that whole sequence, for about 5 minutes straight, it sounds like somebody is just sitting there and bouncing a ball, like bounce on the floor, the wall, back to the floor, to the hand. And it did it for 5 minutes. Like
Wow.
they were just bouncing it. I don't know if that's what it was, but that's what it sounded like. And like I said, it was a mix of residual and intelligent. It almost seemed like they were a little confused by me sleeping in there, but then also just the fact they were kind of going about their normal everyday of what you would be experiencing in a solitary confinement area. And that was really cool. And I think it was probably because I had put myself in that vulnerable state and was just there,
Right.
essentially becoming a part of what was, going on in the moment and not even really interacting.
Well, and you probably confused them because it's like, why is this woman sleeping in solitary
Right.
when all they ever saw was men? And probably, for the most part, they probably didn't have very many female guards.
No. Mm-mm. I know that they did have a few women that worked there, but yeah, for the most part, especially back in the early days, there wasn't any females there. And that's what's so unique when you do get a female voice or when you get a child's voice. And we did get some activity with a child on a couple different times there at Brushy. And, it's different. One, we're accounted for. So if I'm getting these men's voices, there's no man there with me typically. And there's definitely no child. So it's definitely a unique and interesting place. And it does have some dark stuff, but again, you're in a prison. To me, that's really to be expected.
Yeah. And there's no telling how many people were killed in the prison during its years of operations. And some of the nastiest people from Tennessee, murderers and rapists and that type of stuff, were housed there because that was the worst of the worst. And Brushy Mountain's in a valley, for anybody that doesn't know, in the mountains. So if anybody ever escaped, and I think only one person escaped, and they caught him within 2 days because he about died of the elements. But it's in the middle of the mountains in a valley. So if you escape, then you just go up into the mountains. You'll probably get eaten by a bear or a mountain lion, or or exposure to the elements will take you out. So they weren't really worried about people escaping.
No, it had its own natural barrier around it, and because it was the wall that was around it was actually 3 walls. It didn't even have a 4th wall. It used the mountainside as one of its walls. And interesting and ironically enough, this weekend was the Barkley Marathons. And I don't know if you've heard about that, but that's actually based on the escape that happened. The guy who escaped from there was James Earl Ray, the one convicted of killing Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
And he escaped from there. And you're correct, only got a few miles away, and they caught him within a couple days. And the Barkley Marathons were created by, I forget the guy's name. I think it was Laz. And he said that, there's only been, I want to say 15 people who have completed these marathons, and they start over there by the prison, and they're 24 hours. I think it's 100 miles.
Wow.
And they have, these different things that you've got to complete as you're doing it. And people come from all over the world to participate in it. And it's really to kind of prove just how crazy and how treacherous that whole landscape there in the mountains and the elevation change and everything just around that is, and how difficult it is. So it's something that's a tradition that has been going on for, I know since the 80s at least. They've been doing this, and it just happened to be this past weekend.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard of that. I know lots about Brushy Mountain from growing up, in Middle Tennessee, but I never heard of that they did that marathon. That's crazy.
Yeah, look up the Barkley Marathons. They even did a whole documentary on it. It's one of those things you can only get on it by lottery, and it's like $1 entry fee, and you get in it by lottery, and you get a condolence letter to win anyone that's picked. Yeah, so it's like, unfortunately you've been picked. And so they don't know when the marathon's going to start. It's like they camp out there at Frozen Head, and the way it starts is the guy that runs it, he blows into a conch shell, that gives them a notification to get ready. And then once he lights his cigarette, that's when you start. It's a whole crazy thing, and it's definitely worth looking up because, like I said, people come from all over the world to do it, and there's only been either like 13 or 15 people out of all the years that's actually been able to complete it.
Wow. Yeah, and that, like you said, that just tells you how harsh of an environment that mountains are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what do you have coming up? I know you said you're gearing up for season 4 of Ghost Biker Explorations on YouTube, and you have your weekly live chat show that you've been doing with different guests. What do you have coming up here in the near future?
So got a lot of cool things coming up here in 2021. We are working on season 4, actually in filming and production on that right now. That will actually release during the month of October. Every Tuesday night during the month of October at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I'll drop a new episode. And got some really cool places lined up for season 4. And then on the Thursday after each episode drops, I do what I call Behind the Screams Live, where since a lot of the folks that watch my episodes aren't necessarily investigators, I use that time to talk about the location and talk about any of the tools that I used and answer any questions. So all of that will be during the month of October. And I have a bunch of different events coming up, a bunch of meet and greets. I've got those posted on my website as well as my Facebook page. Being a biker, I do something a little different with my meet and greets. They're free, most of them, and they are at different Harley-Davidson dealerships around the country. It gives me the opportunity to come in, talk about hauntings and stuff specific in that area, and then also do the meet and greet and get to meet, it doesn't matter if you ride a motorcycle or not, but get to meet other bikers, other paranormal enthusiasts, and just general history buffs. So that always creates a unique opportunity. And then I also have, like you mentioned, the Ghost Biker Garage. I found that with the pandemic and everything, there was a lot of people that they were really looking for content and looking for other investigators, because like I said, a lot of people that watch mine aren't necessarily paranormal enthusiasts. So they were looking to meet other investigators and other content creators. So I wanted to utilize my Thursday night live stream to introduce people that watch my show to other investigators and other podcasters and people who are out doing things in the historical and paranormal communities. And in the last couple episodes, I've actually had just regular everyday people who have had experiences in their home that come on and talked about that. So it's been kind of something cool and different that I've enjoyed doing, because I've got to really meet a lot of interesting people and other investigators and learn a lot from the people that I've had on the show. So that is every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern time, and it drops live on Facebook, but then it re-airs on YouTube and the local Mix TV here in the Cleveland and Chattanooga area. They air the shows on Saturday night, and then they're also airing my past seasons. So kind of got a big year of filming and events and live streams coming up.
Yeah, I've seen you on a lot of events that's been popping up on my Facebook page here lately. So you definitely got a full schedule coming up.
Yes, working on getting that kind of jam packed. A couple of the places are newer locations that are opening up that I'll be speaking at. So I'm excited about that, because it really does give the opportunity for people in those areas to learn about the preservation and restoration of some of these places, and kind of have the fun paranormal to go along with it. So we've got a bunch of those that's coming up that we'll be announcing soon as well.
And I will put links to all your stuff in the show notes. You can go to ghostbikerexplorations.com for everything going on with Miranda, or look her up on Facebook and also on YouTube. Go subscribe. You got 3 seasons of the Ghost Biker Explorations up there. Everybody needs to go check those out. I will be looking forward to season 4. And like Miranda said, go and check out her Facebook Live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern on Facebook. And I thank you so much today for coming on the show and chatting. I've had a good time.
Absolutely. Me too. Thank you for having me, Eric.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. And as always, we'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.